The Vietnam War was not just another conflict in America's long history of foreign entanglements. It was the most devastating and humiliating military failure the United States had faced since World War II. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, the war drained the U.S. economy of over $168 billion, equivalent to over $1 trillion today, led to the deaths of 58,220 American soldiers, left over 153,000 wounded, and shattered public trust in government institutions. The psychological toll was equally severe. As body bags returned home in the thousands and news broadcasts aired daily scenes of carnage, the American public became deeply divided. The country witnessed massive protests, draft dodging, and the rise of a cynical, disillusioned generation. Political assassinations, riots, and upheaval painted a picture of a nation at war not only abroad but within itself. How did the most powerful military in the world fail to defeat a nation many times smaller and poorer? What were the true costs, economic, political, social, of this conflict? And how has the shadow of Vietnam continued to haunt American foreign policy? This report unpacks the raw numbers and the hidden costs of a war America would rather forget. 1. The human cost. American lives lost in Vietnam. The Vietnam War stands as one of the most tragic chapters in American military history, not merely because of its political consequences, but due to the staggering human cost it imposed on the nation. Between 1955 and 1975, the United States deployed over 2.7 million American service members to Vietnam. Of those, 58,220 never returned home alive. Their names are now immortalized on the black granite walls of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., but behind each name was a family, a community, and a future cut short. Unlike previous wars, the soldiers in Vietnam were not primarily career military men. The average age of the American combat soldier was just 19 years old, far younger than the average soldier in World War II, who was 26. These were young men, often barely out of high school, thrust into a brutal and unfamiliar jungle war thousands of miles from home. The loss of so many in the prime of their lives sent shockwaves through American communities, especially in working-class neighborhoods, which disproportionately bore the burden of the draft. The war's death toll did not include only those killed in action. Many American soldiers died from injuries sustained in battle days or weeks later, succumbing in field hospitals or during medical evacuations. Others perished in helicopter crashes, from disease, or in non-combat-related accidents. Even more disturbing were the cases of fragging instances where American soldiers were killed by their own comrades, a grim indication of the mental and moral breakdown that the war produced within the ranks. Furthermore, over 600 American soldiers are still officially listed as missing in action MIA. Their families have endured decades of uncertainty, clinging to hope or struggling with a lack of closure. The MIA issue became a haunting legacy of the war, spawning documentaries, investigations, and even conspiracy theories that some soldiers might have been left behind. The disproportionate representation of minorities in combat roles also deepened domestic tensions. African Americans made up over 10% of the troops deployed to Vietnam, even though they represented a smaller percentage of the the population at the time. This inequality became a lightning rod for civil rights activists who viewed the war as yet another manifestation of systemic racism. The psychological burden on families of the dead was exacerbated by the shifting narrative of the war itself. As the public grew disillusioned with SOBA involvement and media coverage turned increasingly negative. The deaths of soldiers felt less like sacrifices for a noble cause and more like tragic waste. Unlike the heroes of World War II, many returning veterans, dead or alive, were greeted not with parades, but with indifference or even hostility. The Vietnam War, the costliest defeat, continued. The scale of American casualties in the Vietnam War stands as one of the most sobering reminders of its costs. Over 58,000 American service members lost their lives, and more than 150,000 were wounded, many with life-altering injuries. Thousands returned home, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, emotional trauma, and other invisible wounds. Unlike World War II, where soldiers came home to parades and praise, many Vietnam veterans were met with public disapproval or indifference. This created a generation of disillusioned warriors, many of whom struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. The most devastating cost, however, may have been financial. The Vietnam War drained the economy. Adjusted for inflation, the total expenditure exceeded $1 trillion USD, making it one of the most expensive wars in American history. From funding military operations, maintaining overseas bases, and producing weapons, to supporting South Vietnam's government, the war effort became a black hole for resources. At its peak, $30 billion per year was being spent, money that could have funded education, health care, or domestic infrastructure. But it wasn't just about dollars, it was about trust. The Vietnam War shattered the public's faith in the U.S. government. The release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 revealed that multiple administrations, Democratic and Republican alike, had misled the public about the war's progress and the actual objectives in Southeast Asia. This triggered a massive wave of skepticism, ushering in an era of distrust that still echoes in American political discourse today. The anti-war movement at home intensified as the war dragged on. By the late 1960s, college campuses across the country had become hotbeds of protest. In 1970, the Kent State shootings, where National Guardsmen opened fire on unarmed student protesters, killing 4, shocked the nation. These weren't isolated incidents. Millions of Americans took to the streets, demanding an end to the war. The conflict had not only divided the government and military, but also split the American public in a way not seen since the Civil War. Politically, the war destroyed careers and reshaped the leadership landscape. Lyndon B. Johnson, once popular for his Great Society reforms, chose not to seek re-election in 1968, broken by the backlash over Vietnam. His successor, Richard Nixon, promised peace with honor, but prolonged the war further, including controversial bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos. Eventually, Nixon withdrew U.S. forces, but not before the damage was done, both abroad and at home. Even after the last American combat troops left Vietnam in 1973, the costs continued. Veteran health care expenses skyrocketed, disability claims overwhelmed the system, and the Department of Veterans Affairs struggled to keep up. Many veterans found themselves homeless or jobless, feeling abandoned by the very country they fought for. The social safety net proved inadequate for the unique psychological and physical challenges posed by the war's survivors. Additionally, the war profoundly affected American culture. Hollywood, music, and literature of the 1970s and 1980s often reflected a sense of disillusionment, loss, and questioning of authority. Films like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Full Metal Jacket captured the chaotic, surreal, and morally gray nature of the war. Songs like Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival and Give Peace a Chance by John Lennon became anthems of resistance and grief. The Vietnam War also influenced U.S. foreign policy doctrine for decades, dubbed the Vietnam Syndrome. The memory of failure made American leaders wary of foreign military interventions. It wasn't until the Gulf War in 1991 that the U.S. reasserted itself militarily with confidence. Yet even that success was constantly compared to the haunting lessons of Vietnam. Perhaps the most ironic and heartbreaking aspect of the war is that South Vietnam fell to communist forces in 1975, just 2 years after U.S. withdrawal. After nearly 2 decades of effort, blood, and money. The original goal preventing the spread of communism, the loss of American lives, the destruction in Vietnam, and the immense financial costs had seemingly been in vain. The iconic image of a helicopter evacuating people from the U.S. Embassy rooftop in Saigon remains a powerful symbol of defeat and desperation. The hidden cost, American casualties, and the human toll. While the financial expenditures of the Vietnam War were staggering, the human cost, though often overshadowed by dollar signs, was even more devastating in scope and impact. Over 58,000 American military personnel lost their lives in Vietnam. These weren't just numbers, they were sons, brothers, fathers, and in a few cases, daughters and mothers. Each name etched on the black granite of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. D.C. represents a life cut short, a family shattered, and a future stolen. In addition to the fatalities, more than 150,000 U.S. soldiers were wounded, many suffering life-altering injuries. Some came home with missing limbs, others with burns from napalm, and countless more with invisible wounds, psychological scars that medical science was only beginning to understand. The term post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, wasn't widely recognized until after Vietnam, but its presence was felt profoundly among returning veterans. By some estimates, as many as 700,000 Vietnam veterans required psychological help, and tens of thousands struggled with substance abuse, homelessness, or suicide. A haunting figure often overlooked. Over 2,500 Americans were listed as missing in action, MIA, by the end of the war. The ambiguity of these disappearances plagued families for decades. Even today, the search for remains continues, as efforts to bring closure to grieving relatives have become a solemn, ongoing mission. The draft and the fracturing of American society. Unlike World War II, the Vietnam War was largely fought by conscripts. The selective service system conscripted nearly 2.2 million men into military service during the war, many of whom were from working-class or minority backgrounds. Wealthier and more connected individuals often secured deferments through college enrollment, medical excuses, or influence, fueling a perception that the burden of war was being borne by those with the least power to avoid it. This deepened class divisions and racial tensions across the country. African Americans made up 11% of the U.S. population at the time, but accounted for over 20% of combat deaths in the early years of the war. Although reforms were later introduced to make the draft more equitable, the early disparities stoked anger, leading prominent civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, Jr. to denounce the war as unjust and exploitative. Protests against the draft reached a fever pitch during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Draft card burnings, mass demonstrations, and acts of civil disobedience became common. In one of the most shocking moments, 4 students were shot and killed by National Guard troops at Kent State University in 1970 during an anti-war protest. The tragedy deepened national divides and highlighted just how far the country had fallen into discord. Political fallout, presidents undone by war. No American president emerged unscathed from the Vietnam War. For Lyndon B. Johnson, the war was a slow-motion political suicide. Despite his landmark achievements in civil rights and social programs under the Great Society, his legacy became irrevocably tied to the quagmire of Southeast Asia. By 1968, with American casualties mounting and public opinion turning decisively against the conflict, Johnson chose not to seek re-election. Richard Nixon inherited the war and initially escalated it, secretly bombing Cambodia and Laos in attempts to crush supply lines. Though he later pushed for Vietnamization and negotiated U.S. withdrawal, the damage was done. The release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, which revealed decades of government deception about the war's progress and purpose, further eroded trust in the presidency. Even Nixon's eventual resignation over Watergate was arguably intertwined with Vietnam. The culture of secrecy, paranoia, and abuse of power that characterized his administration was born from the pressures and failures of the war. In short, Vietnam didn't just topple regimes abroad, it destabilized the highest levels of American leadership. The Vietnam War didn't only wreak havoc abroad and stir domestic unrest, it also left a deep and lasting scar on the American economy for decades to follow. The massive federal spending required to sustain the war effort, coupled with the costs of President Johnson's Great Society programs, helped fuel runaway inflation that plagued the U.S. economy throughout the 1970s. The war was financed largely through deficit spending, which contributed to a ballooning national debt and weakened faith in the U.S. dollar. By the early 1970s, this economic strain played a role in one of the most pivotal moments in global financial history, the end of the Bretton Woods system. In 1971, President Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard, effectively severing the dollar's tie to a fixed gold value. This decision, known as the Nixon shock, reshaped the global monetary system and was influenced, in part, by the financial instability that stemmed from the war. The Vietnam War, in this way, not only altered the geopolitical landscape, but also triggered a cascade of events that reshaped the global economy. The societal cost, too, cannot be underestimated. The war intensified America's cultural fragmentation. For some, especially veterans returning to a country that seemed hostile or indifferent, reintegration was painful. Unlike the parades and celebrations that welcomed home Batuu veterans, many Vietnam veterans were met with silence or worse, disdain. Accused by some of being symbols of an unjust war, they bore the psychological weight of both combat trauma and national rejection. This widespread alienation gave rise to veteran advocacy movements, as those who had served in Vietnam fought for recognition, support, and medical treatment. The establishment of the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA healthcare system, and subsequent reforms were shaped by their activism. In many ways, the war exposed how ill-prepared the U. Government was to care for its own soldiers once they returned from battle, especially from a war it failed to win. The psychological trauma extended beyond the veterans themselves. A generation of Americans grew up under the shadow of the war, distrustful of authority, cynical about patriotism, and skeptical of U.S. foreign policy. The so-called Vietnam Syndrome, an aversion to overseas military entanglements, became a defining feature of American political life for decades. It wasn't until the Gulf War in 1991 that U.S. leaders felt confident enough to engage militarily abroad without triggering widespread public backlash rooted in Vietnam-era memories. Even Hollywood was shaped by the war's lingering impact. Films like The Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now, and Platoon didn't just entertain, they became cultural reckonings, grappling with the moral ambiguity, brutality, and psychological toll of the conflict. These stories didn't glorify war. Instead, they forced American audiences to confront what had been done in their name, and at what cost. The environment in Vietnam itself was also devastated by American tactics. The use of chemical defoliants like Agent Orange, intended to deny the Viet Cong cover in the dense jungles, resulted in catastrophic health consequences. Not only did it affect generations of Vietnamese civilians, but American soldiers exposed to the toxins also suffered from cancers, birth defects in their children, and chronic illnesses. To this day, lawsuits and medical compensation claims related to Agent Orange remain unresolved for many veterans and their families. The aftermath, counting the cost of a nation's deepest wound. When the final U.S. troops withdrew from Vietnam in 1973, and especially after the fall of Saigon in 1975, America did not emerge as a victor, but as a nation deeply shaken morally, politically, and economically. For the United States, the war's end did not signal triumph, but reckoning. The psychological toll, a nation in mourning. Beyond the staggering numbers of dead and wounded, the psychological impact of the Vietnam War on American society was profound and far-reaching. For returning soldiers, the homecoming was often met not with celebration, but with silence, stigma, or even hostility. Unlike previous wars, Vietnam veterans came home to a deeply divided society that offered little support. An estimated 700,000 Vietnam veterans suffered from psychological after-effects, primarily post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD). Many struggled with unemployment, addiction, homelessness, and family breakdowns. Suicide rates among veterans skyrocketed. For countless families across the country, the war never really ended. And for those who never served but watched the war unfold on television, night after night, the images of napalm-stricken children, burning villages, and body bags created a lasting trauma. It was the first televised war, and it left indelible scars on the American psyche. The crisis of trust, from patriotism to protest, the Vietnam War triggered a profound crisis of faith in government. From the early years of optimistic military escalation under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson to the growing disillusionment under Nixon, the American public was systematically misled about the reality on the ground. The infamous Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, revealed that successive administrations had knowingly deceived the public about the progress and purpose of the war. This breach of trust was seismic. Confidence in political institutions eroded rapidly, fueling anti-government sentiment that would shape American politics for decades to come. The war catalyzed the rise of the counterculture movement, mass protests, draft card burnings, and a general questioning of the very foundations of foreign policy. By the early 1970s, nearly 60% of Americans believed U.S. involvement in Vietnam was a mistake. That level of disillusionment hadn't been seen since the Great Depression. Economic fallout, a war that bled the Treasury. While official figures cite the cost of the Vietnam War at around $168 billion, equivalent to over $1 trillion today, this number does not reflect the long-term economic consequences. The war diverted federal spending from domestic priorities, including infrastructure, education, and health care. Inflation surged in the early 1970s, and the U.S. economy entered a period of stagflation, high inflation, coupled with the economic stagnation. The draft itself had economic consequences, removing millions of young men from the workforce and disrupting countless lives and communities. Businesses were affected. Universities became battlegrounds for protest. The war drained not just money, but morale and momentum from a rising generation. Moreover, the long-term costs, veterans' benefits, health care, disability payments continue to this day. Estimates suggest that post-war veteran-related expenses have exceeded $500 billion, an ongoing burden on federal budgets. Diplomatic damage. A tarnished global image before Vietnam. The United States had been widely seen as a beacon of democracy and freedom, especially after its role in defeating fascism during World War II. But Vietnam changed that. The brutal tactics used carpet bombing, chemical defoliants like Agent Orange, and the My Lai massacre, where over 500 unarmed civilians were slaughtered, undermined America's moral authority on the world stage. Allegations of war crimes and the targeting of civilians made headlines around the world. Protests erupted not only in American cities but also in London, Paris, Berlin, and Tokyo. Allies began to question U.S. leadership. Enemies saw weakness and inconsistency. Vietnam demonstrated that military might alone could not guarantee success, especially in conflicts rooted in national identity and civil resistance. Cultural fragmentation. The war that split a generation. Perhaps most tragically, the war splintered American society along generational, racial, and class lines. Young versus old, black versus white, rural versus urban. The divisions deepened. Working class and minority communities bore a disproportionate share of the combat burden. African American soldiers, for instance, made up a significantly higher percentage of combat troops compared to their share of the U.S. population. These inequalities intensified racial tensions already inflamed by the civil rights movement. College students, often exempted from the draft through deferments, became the core of the anti-war movement. The result was a stark class divide, those who could avoid the war, and those who could not. This cultural rift culminated in tragedies like the Kent State shootings, where National Guard troops killed 4 unarmed student protesters in 1970. The images shocked the nation and symbolized the domestic cost of a foreign war. Legacy of doubt. The Vietnam Syndrome. In the years that followed, our foreign policy was haunted by what came to be known as the Vietnam Syndrome, a deep reluctance to engage in foreign military interventions for fear of becoming mired in another quagmire. Presidents from Gerald Ford to George H.W. Bush navigated global crises with the shadow of Vietnam looming overhead. It wasn't until the Gulf War in 1991 that the U.S. would again mount a major military operation with broad domestic support. Even today, debates over American intervention in Iraq, Afghanistan, or elsewhere are inevitably colored by the lessons and wounds of Vietnam. It remains the yardstick by which all other foreign policy disasters are measured. Conclusion: a price too high to forget. The Vietnam War was not just a military defeat. It was a moral, psychological, and political unraveling. 58,200 Americans dead, over 300,000 wounded, as billions of dollars spent, and a society left fractured and uncertain of its future. It was the most divisive conflict in American history since the Civil War, a turning point after which America would never be quite the same. The statistics, while sobering, only begin to capture the depth of the loss. Behind every number was a name, a family, a story interrupted. Vietnam was a war that America entered with bold declarations and exited in silence and shame. It was not simply a foreign policy failure. It was a national tragedy, one that continues to echo through American memory, culture, and politics. As we count the cost, we must remember not just what was lost on the battlefield, but what was lost at home: trust, unity, and the belief in an invincible America.